The diary was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle as autumn leaves. When the construction crew found it sealed behind a false wall in the basement of the old Brennan house on Maple Street, they almost threw it away with the rest of the debris. Almost. But something about the way it had been hidden, wrapped in oilcloth, placed inside a tin box, then bricked into a cavity that had been deliberately constructed to conceal it, made the foreman pause. He opened it carefully, and the first words he read made his hands tremble. "May God forgive me for what I have done. 300 souls passed through this house, and not one of them left the way they came in." The date on that entry was November 14, 1860. The signature at the bottom read, Hannah Grace Brennan. The name meant nothing to the foreman, but it would soon mean everything to the historians who descended upon that modest two-story house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Because Hannah Grace Brennan had been, according to all official records, a widow who lived alone, kept to herself, and died quietly in her sleep in 1862. She had no children, no close relatives, and apparently no remarkable life story worth recording. But that diary told a different story entirely, a story that would raise questions no one could fully answer, a story about 300 people who entered her house between 1856 and 1861, and whose fates remained even after the diary's discovery disturbingly unclear. The foreman, a man named Robert Chen, who had been in the construction business for 20 years, would later say that he felt something wrong the moment he broke through that wall. The air that escaped from the cavity was cold, unnaturally cold for a summer day, and it carried a smell he couldn't quite place. Not decay exactly, but something stale and ancient, like the air in a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. His crew wanted to continue with the demolition, but Chen insisted on examining the box first. When he opened it and saw the diary, he knew immediately that this was something significant. The house had been scheduled for demolition to make way for a new shopping center. It had sat vacant for 3 years, ever since the last owner had moved out abruptly in the middle of the night, leaving behind most of his possessions. Before that, the property record showed a long string of short-term residents, none staying more than a year or two. The house had a reputation in the neighborhood, a reputation for being strange, unsettling, wrong somehow. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Real estate agents had trouble selling it, even at prices well below market value. Now, with the diary in hand, Chen began to understand why. Hannah Grace was born on a frigid January morning in 1818, the second daughter of Samuel and Rachel Yoda. The Yoda farm sat on 120 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland, about 8 miles outside of Lancaster. It was not a prosperous farm. The soil was rocky and difficult to work, and the growing season was short. But Samuel Yoda was a determined man, and his family never went hungry. The Yodas were Mennonites, part of a close-knit community that valued simplicity, hard work, and devotion to God above all else. Hannah grew up in a world of strict discipline and clear expectations. She woke before dawn to milk the cows and gather eggs. She spent her days helping her mother with cooking, cleaning, sewing, and preserving food for the winter. She attended church services twice a week and prayer meetings every evening. She learned to read from the family Bible, and she was taught that pride, vanity, and worldly ambition were sins that would lead her soul to perdition. But Hannah was different from her older sister Mary, who accepted these teachings without question. Hannah asked questions. She wondered why God would create people only to condemn them to slavery. She questioned why women were expected to obey men without protest, why children were beaten for minor transgressions, why suffering was considered noble and joy was viewed with suspicion. She never voiced these questions aloud. She was not foolish, but her mother saw the doubt in her eyes and it worried her. "You have a restless spirit, Hannah." Rachel Yoda told her daughter when Hannah was 15, "That restlessness will bring you nothing but sorrow. You must learn to accept what God has ordained for you and find peace in obedience." Hannah tried. She truly did. She threw herself into her work, hoping that exhaustion would quiet the questions in her mind. She memorized scripture, hoping that God's word would give her the peace her mother promised. She prayed for hours, kneeling on the hard wooden floor of her room until her knees ached and her back cramped, begging God to take away her doubts and make her into the obedient daughter she was supposed to be. But the questions never went away. They only grew louder. When Hannah was 19, her father took her to Lancaster to sell eggs and butter at the market. It was there that she met Thomas Brennan for the first time. He was working as a carpenter's apprentice, helping to build a new storefront on Queen Street. Hannah walked past the construction site on her way to the market, and Thomas looked up from his work and smiled at her. It was a simple smile, nothing inappropriate or forward, just a friendly acknowledgement of her presence. But something about that smile, the warmth in it, the genuine kindness stayed with Hannah long after she returned to the farm. She saw Thomas again 3 weeks later when her father brought her back to Lancaster. This time Thomas spoke to her. He asked her name, told her his own, and commented on the fine weather they were having. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but Hannah thought about it for days afterward. She had never spoken to a young man outside of her church community before, and certainly never to someone like Thomas, an Irish Catholic immigrant, exactly the kind of person her father warned her to avoid. But there was something about Thomas that drew her. He was kind. He was respectful. And unlike the young Mennonite men who sometimes came calling at the Yoda farm with their parents' approval, Thomas looked at Hannah as if he saw her, really saw her, not just as a potential wife or mother to future children, but as a person in her own right. Over the next 6 months, Hannah found excuses to go to Lancaster whenever possible. She volunteered to make the weekly trip to market. She offered to deliver eggs to customers in town, and each time she managed to walk past the place where Thomas was working, and each time they spoke a little longer. Thomas told her about his life in Ireland, about the poverty and hunger that had driven his family to immigrate, about his parents who had died during the voyage across the Atlantic, leaving Thomas alone in a new country at the age of 16. Hannah told him about the farm, about her family, about the questions that plagued her and the doubts she could never voice. They fell in love slowly, carefully, knowing that their relationship was impossible. Hannah's father would never approve of her marrying outside the faith. Thomas had almost nothing to offer. He was a laborer with no prospects, no land, no family connections. But they were young, and they were stubborn, and they believed that love could overcome any obstacle. They were wrong. Of course, love could not overcome the fury of Samuel Yoda when he discovered that his daughter had been meeting secretly with an Irish Catholic. Love could not overcome the scandal that erupted in the Mennonite community when word got out. Love could not overcome the threat of total disownment that Hannah's father issued, telling her that if she married Thomas Brennan, she would be dead to her family, cast out and forgotten as if she had never existed. But Hannah had spent her whole life being obedient, being quiet, swallowing her questions and her doubts and her desires, and she discovered that there was a limit to how much she could swallow. When faced with the choice between the life her family had planned for her and the life she wanted for herself, Hannah chose herself. She married Thomas Brennan in the summer of 1839 in a small civil ceremony with no family present. She was 21 years old. Her father kept his word. From that day forward, the Yodar family never spoke Hannah's name again. Her mother, her sister, her younger brothers, all of them treated her as if she had died. When Hannah tried to visit the farm a few months after the wedding, her father met her at the gate with a rifle and told her that if she ever set foot on his property again, he would shoot her. Hannah wept all the way back to Lancaster, but she did not regret her choice. She had Thomas, and that was enough. Thomas and Hannah built their life together slowly, carefully, like Thomas built the houses and storefronts that were his trade. They rented a small apartment above a bakery for the first 3 years of their marriage, saving every penny they could spare. Hannah took in sewing and laundry, her fingers working late into the night by candlelight, stitching hems and darning socks and washing other people's linens. Thomas worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, taking on any job that would pay. They ate simple meals, wore simple clothes, and dreamed of the day when they could afford a home of their own. That day came in 1842. The house on Maple Street was not impressive. It was a simple 2-story structure that had been poorly maintained by its previous owner, but it was theirs. Thomas spent months repairing it, replacing rotten boards, fixing the leaking roof, rebuilding the sagging front porch. Hannah cleaned every inch of it, scrubbing away years of neglect until the floor shone and the windows sparkled. They planted a small garden in the backyard, and Hannah grew vegetables and herbs that she used to make their meals. They were happy, not wealthy, not comfortable in any material sense, but happy. They had each other, and they had their home, and that seemed like enough. But there was one sadness that shadowed their happiness. Hannah did not conceive. Month after month, year after year, she hoped and prayed for a child, but none came. She consulted with doctors who told her there was nothing wrong with her that they could detect. She tried folk remedies suggested by the other women in the neighborhood. Teas made from raspberry leaves, spices applied to her abdomen. Charms and prayers and superstitions. Nothing worked. Thomas told her it didn't matter that he loved her whether they had children or not. But Hannah knew it mattered to him even if he wouldn't admit it. She saw the way he looked at other men's children, the longing in his eyes, She heard the slight change in his voice when their neighbors talked about their sons and daughters, and she felt the weight of her failure pressing down on her like a stone. By 1850, Hannah had accepted that she would never be a mother. She was 32 years old, and she had been married for 11 years. If children were going to come, they would have come by now. She tried to make peace with this reality, tried to find purpose in other things. Her work, her marriage, her small circle of friends in the neighborhood, but there was always a hollowness inside her, a sense that something fundamental was missing from her life. Thomas never reproached her for her childlessness. He never suggested, as some of the neighbors did, that perhaps God was punishing her for defying her family and marrying outside her faith. He simply loved her steadily and faithfully and tried to make her happy in whatever ways he could. In 1853, Thomas began working on a large construction project, a new bank building in the center of Lancaster. It was the biggest job he had ever been part of, and he was proud to be chosen for the crew. The work was dangerous, but the pay was good, and Thomas dreamed of saving enough to expand their house, maybe add a third bedroom, build a proper workshop in the backyard where he could take on projects of his own. He never got the chance. On a cold morning in February of 1854, a support beam collapsed. Thomas was standing directly beneath it. He died instantly, his chest crushed, his neck broken. He was 36 years old. Hannah's world ended that day. The neighbors who had been her friends suddenly became distant, uncomfortable with her grief, uncertain how to help. The women brought food, but they didn't stay long. The men offered to help with repairs around the house, but their offers were perfunctory, obligatory. Hannah realized that she had become something people didn't know how to handle. A childless widow with no family, no real place in the community. She buried Thomas in the Catholic cemetery even though she was not Catholic herself. She stood alone at his grave while the priest spoke words she barely heard, and then she went home to the empty house on Maple Street and tried to figure out how to continue living. The months after Thomas's death were the darkest of Hannah's life. She moved through her days like a ghost, going through the motions of survival without any real sense of purpose. She continued to take in sewing and laundry because she needed the money to pay her rent and buy food. She attended church services, though she no longer prayed with any real hope that God was listening. She kept the house clean and the garden tended because those were the things she had always done, and she didn't know what else to do. The neighbors whispered about her. They said grief had made her strange. They said she talked to herself, that she sometimes stood in her yard at night staring at nothing, that lights burned in her windows at all hours. Some of this was true. Hannah did talk to Thomas sometimes as if he were still there. She did stand outside at night because sleep eluded her and the darkness felt less oppressive than the empty house. And yes, she kept candles burning because the thought of sitting alone in the dark was unbearable. But the neighbors didn't understand. They saw her behavior as madness, as something to be pied or feared. They didn't see that Hannah was simply trying to survive the unsurvivable, trying to find a way to keep living when the only person who had ever truly loved her was gone. And then on a cold night in March of 1856, someone knocked on her door. Hannah almost didn't answer. It was late, well past 10 o'clock, and she wasn't expecting anyone. But the knocking continued, soft but insistent, and finally, more out of curiosity than anything else, Hannah opened the door. The man standing on her porch was tall and thin, his clothes ragged and dirty. His face was haggarded, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. He looked at Hannah for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he could trust her. And then he spoke in a low, urgent voice. "They told me you might help," he said. "They said this house was safe." Hannah didn't understand at first. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Help with what?" The man glanced over his shoulder, checking the dark street behind him. "Please," he said. "Can I come inside? I can't stay out here, if they find me." He didn't finish the sentence, but Hannah saw the terror in his eyes, and something inside her responded. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter quickly. He slipped past her, and she closed the door, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she asked. "What's happened?" The man stood in her hallway, trembling despite the warmth from the fireplace. "My name is Nathan," he said. "I've been traveling for 2 weeks. I was told there were safe houses along this route, places where people like me could rest. Someone in Philadelphia said I should come here to this address. They said a woman lived here who helped people. Are you that woman?" Hannah stared at him, understanding beginning to dawn. "People like you," she repeated slowly. "You mean I was enslaved?" Nathan said bluntly. "In Maryland, I escaped, and now I'm trying to get to Canada where I'll be free, but I can't make it without help. I'm injured, my feet are badly cut, and I think I have a fever. I just need 1 night, maybe 2, somewhere safe to rest. Then I'll be gone. You'll never see me again." Hannah's first instinct was to refuse. What Nathan was asking was illegal. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a federal crime to harbor escaped slaves, punishable by fines and imprisonment. If Hannah was caught helping him, she could lose everything: her house, her freedom, possibly her life. But as she looked at Nathan standing in her hallway, exhausted and terrified and desperate, she thought about her own life, about the years she had spent swallowing her questions and her doubts, being obedient, following the rules, about the choice she had finally made to defy her family and marry Thomas, and how that choice had been the only real moment of courage in her entire life, about the emptiness that had consumed her since Thomas's death, the sense that her life had no purpose, no meaning, no value. And she thought about something Thomas had said to her once years ago. They had been talking about slavery, about the growing tensions in the country, and Thomas had said, "If someone came to our door asking for help, I'd like to think we'd be brave enough to give it, no matter the cost." Hannah had agreed with him then. Now she had a chance to prove whether she had meant it. "Come in," she said to Nathan. "Come into the kitchen, let me look at your feet, and I'll get you something to eat." She brought him to the kitchen and lit more candles so she could see clearly. Nathan's feet were indeed badly cut, the soles torn and bleeding from walking long distances over rough terrain. Hannah boiled water and carefully cleaned the wounds, then bandaged them with strips of clean cloth. She gave him bread, cheese, and cold chicken left over from her own dinner. She watched him eat ravenously, barely pausing to chew, and she realized that he probably hadn't had a real meal in days. "You can sleep in the cellar," she told him. "It's not comfortable, but it's warm and dry, and no one will see you there. I'll bring you more food in the morning." Nathan looked at her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means. I was starting to think I wouldn't make it." "How far do you still have to go?" Hannah asked. "Canada is about 300 miles north," Nathan said, "but I can't travel on the roads during the day. Too dangerous. So, it'll take me weeks, maybe months, and I don't know the way. I'm just following the directions people give me, hoping I don't get lost." Hannah led him down to the cellar, which was cold and damp, but at least provided shelter. She gave him blankets and promised to check on him in the morning. Then she went back upstairs, locked the door, and sat in her kitchen with her head in her hands, wondering what she had just done. Nathan stayed for 3 days. His fever broke on the second day, and by the third he was strong enough to continue his journey. Before he left, he thanked Hannah again and told her something that would change the course of her life. "There will be others," he said. "Word spreads among us about which houses are safe. I'll tell the next person I meet, and they'll tell others. If you're willing to help, people will come." And then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness, heading north toward freedom or death. Hannah didn't know which, and she never saw him again. But he had been right about one thing. Others came. The second person to knock on Hannah's door came 2 weeks after Nathan left. This time, it was a woman named Esther, traveling with a baby boy strapped to her back. Esther was younger than Hannah, probably in her early 20s, and she was so exhausted she could barely stand. Hannah took her in without hesitation this time, gave her food and a place to sleep, and cared for the baby while Esther recovered her strength. Esther stayed for 5 days. On the last night, she told Hannah her story. She had been enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, where she had been born and had lived her entire life. The baby's father was the plantation owner's son who had forced himself on Esther repeatedly. When she became pregnant, she had begged to be allowed to keep her child, but the owner had told her that the baby would be sold as soon as he was weaned. Esther had decided then that she would rather die trying to escape than watch her son be taken from her. Hannah held the baby while Esther spoke, feeling the small, warm weight of him in her arms. And something inside her shifted. She thought about the child she had never been able to have, about all the love she had stored up with nowhere to put it. And she realized that maybe this was her purpose. Maybe this was why God had never given her children of her own, so that she could help save other people's children instead. It was a comforting thought. It gave her grief a meaning it had never had before. After Esther left, more people came, sometimes 1 or 2 a month, sometimes more. Hannah began to develop a system. She kept extra food stored in the cellar: dried beans, cornmeal, salted meat, things that would last. She kept bandages and basic medicines on hand. She learned which neighbors were sympathetic to the abolitionist cause and which ones might report her to the authorities. She became careful, vigilant, always watching for signs of danger, and she began to change the house. The cellar, as it was, could hide maybe 2 or 3 people at most. If more than that arrived at once, and they increasingly did, as word spread, Hannah had nowhere to put them. She couldn't let them stay in the main house, where they might be seen through the windows. So, in the summer of 1856, Hannah hired a German immigrant named Friedrich to help her expand the cellar. Friedrich spoke very little English, which Hannah considered an advantage. She told him she needed more storage space for preserves and root vegetables, and he nodded and began to dig. Over the course of 6 weeks, he excavated a much larger space beneath the house, shoring up the walls with timber and brick. The work was slow and difficult, but Friedrich was patient and thorough. When he finished, Hannah paid him what she could afford and gave him extra food to take home to his family. But the expanded cellar was only the beginning. Hannah began to see possibilities she hadn't noticed before. The house had been built in 1828, and like many houses of that era, it had irregular angles and odd spaces, closets that were deeper than they appeared, walls that seemed thicker than necessary. Hannah started measuring these spaces, calculating how they might be modified to create hiding places. She hired different workers to do different jobs, making sure that none of them saw the full scope of what she was creating. One man built a false wall in the cellar, creating a hidden room behind a heavy shelf. Another installed a trap door in the floor of the pantry, concealed beneath a rug. A third dug a tunnel from the cellar to the small shed in the backyard so that people could enter and leave without being seen from the street. The work took months and cost nearly all of Hannah's savings. She stopped eating regular meals, surviving on bread and water so she could afford to pay the workers. She sold her wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry she owned, and used the money to buy timber and bricks. She worked alongside the laborers, her hands blistering and bleeding, her back aching, driven by a purpose she couldn't fully explain even to herself. By the end of 1856, Hannah's house had been transformed. From the outside, it looked exactly as it always had, a modest, unremarkable home. But inside, it was something else entirely, a network of hidden rooms and secret passages designed to conceal people from the world. And the people came, more and more of them, following the invisible trail that had been blazed by Nathan and Esther and the others who had passed through before them. They came alone and in pairs, in families with children, in groups of 5 or 6, traveling together. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the desperate hope that they might somehow make it to freedom. Hannah took them all in. She fed them, clothed them, tended to their injuries, and sent them on their way when they were strong enough to continue. She never asked for payment. She knew they had nothing to give, and she never judged them for the crimes they had committed in pursuit of freedom. Theft sometimes, violence occasionally when it was necessary for survival. She simply helped them because it was the right thing to do, and because it gave her life a meaning it had lacked since Thomas died. But as 1857 began, Hannah started to notice something strange, something that would, over time, evolve into the deep mystery at the heart of her story. The first strange occurrence happened in January of 1857. Hannah had 3 people staying in the hidden cellar rooms, a teenage boy named Marcus and 2 older men who had been traveling together. Hannah brought them food one evening, as she did every day, and when she opened the hidden door behind the shelf, she found only Marcus. The 2 men were gone. At first, Hannah assumed they had simply left without telling her. It annoyed her. She preferred to know when people departed so she could give them food for their journey and directions to the next safe house. But it wasn't unheard of. Some people were so traumatized, so distrustful of everyone that they slipped away without warning. But when Hannah talked to Marcus, he insisted the men had never left. "They were here an hour ago," Marcus said, confused. "We were all talking and then you called me upstairs to help you carry something, remember? When I came back down, they were gone, but I didn't hear them leave. The door never opened." Hannah didn't remember calling Marcus upstairs. She said so, and Marcus looked at her strangely. "But you did," he insisted. "You opened the door and told me you needed help moving a heavy chest. I went up, but you weren't there, so I came back down. And that's when I noticed they were gone." Hannah searched the entire cellar, including all the hidden rooms and the tunnel to the shed. She found no trace of the 2 men, no belongings, no signs they had ever been there at all. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Marcus left the next day, still confused about what had happened. Hannah tried to put the incident out of her mind, telling herself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the men had found another way out that she didn't know about. Maybe Marcus had been confused about the timing. Maybe they had left while Marcus was asleep. But then it happened again and again. People who should have been in the hidden rooms simply weren't there when Hannah went to check on them. Sometimes their belongings were gone too. Sometimes their belongings remained, as if they had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Hannah began keeping more detailed records, writing down the names of everyone who stayed in her house, when they arrived and when they left. She noted every strange occurrence, every disappearance, every moment when things didn't quite make sense. And as the months passed, the entries in her diary became increasingly troubled. "I am losing track," she wrote in April of 1857. "I know that 7 people arrived this month, but when I count the people currently staying in the house, I can only account for 5. Where did the other 2 go? Did they leave without telling me? Or am I simply forgetting that they already departed? My mind feels foggy lately, as if I'm walking through a dream and cannot quite wake up." The house itself seemed to be changing too. Hannah would walk into a room and feel as though the proportions were slightly off, as though the walls had shifted a few inches while she wasn't looking. She would climb the stairs and count 13 steps one day, 14 the next. She would open a closet and find it deeper than she remembered, or shallower, or facing a different direction entirely. She told herself she was exhausted, that she wasn't sleeping enough, that the stress of harboring fugitives was taking a toll on her mental health. And that was certainly true. She was averaging maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, and she was constantly on edge, always listening for the knock on the door that might signal either a new arrival or a federal marshal coming to arrest her. But deep down, Hannah knew that something else was happening, something she couldn't explain with logic or reason. The house was doing something to the people who stayed there, changing them somehow, or changing the way they moved through space. Or, and this was the thought that frightened her most, keeping them. In October of 1857, Hannah had a visitor who would force her to confront these fears directly. Her name was Sarah Ann, and she arrived on a cold October night with a young girl of about 8 or 9. The girl was Sarah Ann's daughter, she explained, though the family resemblance was not strong. The child was very light-skinned with hazel eyes and loose brown curls, while Sarah Ann had dark skin and tightly coiled black hair. Hannah understood immediately what this meant. The child's father must have been white, probably the man who owned Sarah Ann. It was a common story and always a tragic one. Sarah Ann and her daughter, whose name was Lily, stayed in Hannah's house for 2 weeks. Sarah Ann had injured her ankle while escaping, and it needed time to heal before she could continue traveling. During those 2 weeks, Hannah grew attached to both of them, especially to Lily, who was a bright, curious child despite everything she had been through. Lily liked to draw. Hannah gave her paper and pencils, and Lily would sit for hours in the hidden cellar room, creating pictures of the things she remembered. Flowers she had seen, animals from the plantation, her mother's face. But she also drew other things, strange things that made Hannah uncomfortable when she saw them. She drew the house. But in her drawings, the house had too many rooms. Rooms that spiraled inward into darkness, rooms that folded back on themselves, rooms that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. "What is this?" Hannah asked, pointing to one of the drawings. "The rooms where people sleep," Lily said simply. "But there aren't this many rooms," Hannah said. "I only built 3 hidden spaces." Lily looked at her with those strange hazel eyes. "There are more now," she said. "They keep growing. Don't you hear them at night? The house is always building more rooms." Hannah felt a chill run through her. She wanted to dismiss Lily's words as a child's imagination, but she couldn't because she had heard things at night, sounds like hammering and soaring, sounds like construction happening somewhere deep beneath the house. She had told herself she was dreaming, or that the sounds were coming from a neighbor's property. But what if they weren't? Sarah, Ann, and Lily left on a sunny morning in late October. Hannah packed them food for the journey and gave them detailed directions to the next safe house about 30 minutes north. She hugged them both goodbye and watched them disappear down the street, heading toward a future that might hold freedom or might hold death. Hannah would never know which. But 3 days later, Hannah was in the cellar bringing food to a new arrival when she heard a child's voice singing. She froze, listening. The voice was coming from somewhere behind the walls, thin and distant, but unmistakable, and the song was one that Lily had sung constantly during her stay. A simple melody that Sarah Ann said had been passed down through generations. Hannah pressed her ear to the wall, her heart pounding. The singing continued for a few more seconds, and then it stopped. Hannah waited, but it didn't resume. She told herself she had imagined it. Lily was 30 minutes away by now, maybe more. The singing couldn't possibly have been her voice, but Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, despite having left 3 days ago, Lily was still in the house, still somewhere in the maze of hidden rooms that had grown far beyond what Hannah had built. As 1858 began, Hannah's obsession with the house deepened. She spent hours in the cellar mapping the spaces she had created, measuring the distances between rooms, trying to understand the architecture of what she had built. But the measurements never made sense. The hidden rooms seemed to take up more space than should have been possible within the footprint of the house. The tunnel to the shed was longer than it should have been. Hannah paced out one day and counted nearly 70 feet, when the distance from the cellar to the shed was no more than 30 feet. She hired more workers, telling them she wanted to make improvements to the house. She had them build additional storage spaces, more false walls, another concealed door. But each time they finished a project, Hannah would discover that the work had somehow created more than she had commissioned. A closet that should have been 6 feet deep would be 12 feet deep. A hidden room that should have measured 8 by 10 feet would turn out to be nearly twice that size. The workers noticed the anomalies, but they didn't comment on them. They simply did the work, collected their pay, and left. Hannah wondered if they were afraid of her, if they thought she was mad. She wondered if she was mad, but the people kept coming. 50 people had passed through her house by the end of 1857. By the middle of 1858, the number had climbed to more than 100. Hannah recorded each one meticulously in her diary, their names, if they would give them, their injuries and illnesses, how long they stayed, where they said they were heading. But she also recorded the disappearances, the people who vanished from the hidden rooms without explanation, the voices she heard singing or speaking in languages she didn't recognize, the footsteps that echoed through the walls at night, the cold spots that appeared in certain areas of the cellar, places where the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees for no reason. In August of 1858, Hannah had her closest call with the authorities. 2 federal marshals came to her door, saying they had received reports of suspicious activity at her address. Hannah let them search the house just as she had done before. But this time, there were 7 people hiding in the cellar, 3 adults and 4 children. If the marshals found them, everyone would be arrested, including Hannah. The marshals searched methodically, going through every room upstairs first, then heading down to the cellar. Hannah followed them, her mind racing, trying to think of some way to distract them or delay them, but she needn't have worried. The marshals walked right past the shelf that concealed the hidden door. One of them even leaned against it while examining the rest of the cellar, but they didn't move it, didn't notice anything unusual about it. When they left, apologizing again for the intrusion, Hannah went down to check on the people in the hidden rooms. But when she moved the shelf aside and opened the door, the rooms were empty. The 7 people who had been there just an hour earlier were gone. Their belongings were gone. There was no sign they had ever been there. Hannah stood in the empty room for a long time, her candle casting flickering shadows on the walls, and she wondered if she had imagined them entirely. Maybe there had never been 7 people. Maybe her mind was fracturing under the strain of what she was doing, and she was seeing things that weren't there, creating guests who didn't exist. But that night, as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she heard them. Voices drifting up through the floorboards, too muffled to make out words, but clear enough to know they were there. The 7 people she thought had vanished. They were still in her house somewhere, in rooms she hadn't built, in spaces that shouldn't exist. And Hannah realized with a clarity that was almost like a revelation that the house was alive. It was growing, evolving, creating spaces to hide the people who came to it seeking shelter. And once it took them in, it didn't always let them go. The entries from late 1858 through 1859 show Hannah's mental state deteriorating. Her handwriting becomes less careful, more hurried. She crosses out words and rewrites them. She starts and abandons sentences mid-thought. She writes the same entry multiple times on different pages as if she's forgotten that she already recorded the information. November 3rd, 1858. A family of 4 arrived tonight. Mother, father, 2 children. I gave them the large room at the end of the tunnel. They seemed grateful. The father wept. November 3rd, 1858. Was it a family? I thought it was 5 people or maybe 6. I cannot remember. The faces blur together now. There are so many faces. November 3rd, 1858. No one came tonight. The house is empty. I am alone. All 3 entries are dated the same day, but they contradict each other completely. Either Hannah was confused about the date, or her memory was failing, or, and this is what historians would later debate, something about the house itself was causing her to experience time differently. She wrote about dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams in which she walked through infinite corridors lined with doors, and behind each door was a person she had helped, safe and sleeping. Dreams in which Thomas was still alive, working in the cellar, expanding it room by room, his hammer ringing against nails in a rhythm that never stopped. Dreams in which she was underground, deep beneath the house in a vast space that hummed with the presence of hundreds of people, all of them waiting, all of them silent. She wrote about losing time. She would start a task in the morning and suddenly it would be night with no memory of the hours in between. She would go down to the cellar to bring food to her guests and emerge to find that 3 days had passed. She would talk to people who claimed they had been staying in her house for weeks, though she had no memory of them arriving. "I am not well," she wrote in January of 1859. "I know I am not well, but I cannot stop. They need me. All of them need me. And if I stop, if I close the door and turn them away, what will happen to them? They will be captured. They will be sent back. They will suffer. I cannot allow that. I will not allow that, even if it costs me everything, even if it costs me my sanity." In March of 1859, Hannah hired yet another worker, a man named Douglas, who specialized in masonry. She commissioned him to build what she called the final expansion, a series of brick-lined chambers beneath the deepest part of the cellar, accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling on hands and knees. Douglas worked for 3 months on the project, and when he finished, he told Hannah he had never built anything quite like it. "It's like a catacomb," he said, "like something from the old country. Why would you want such a thing beneath your house?" Hannah didn't answer. She paid him double what they had agreed upon, and she made him promise never to speak of the work to anyone. Douglas took the money and left, and Hannah never saw him again. The final expansion was different from the other hidden spaces. It was colder down there, and the air had a strange quality, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. Hannah found that she could hear things in those deepest rooms that she couldn't hear anywhere else. Whispers, singing, prayers spoken in voices that might have been memories or might have been something else entirely. She began bringing people down to those rooms, the ones who seemed most desperate, most frightened, most in need of absolute concealment, and once she brought them down there, she rarely saw them leave. "They are safe now," she wrote in her diary. "Safer than they have ever been. The house will protect them. The house will keep them hidden until the war comes. And the war is coming. I can feel it. The whole country is holding its breath, waiting for the violence to begin. But here in my house, they will be safe. All of them will be safe." By January of 1860, Hannah estimated that more than 200 people had passed through her house. The number was staggering, almost impossible to believe. But Hannah had kept records, and the records didn't lie, or at least they hadn't lied at first, when Hannah's mind was still clear and her memory still functioned properly. Now, though, she wasn't certain of anything. The records contradicted themselves. The numbers didn't add up. She would count the people currently staying in the hidden rooms and get a different total every time. Sometimes 8, sometimes 15, sometimes more than 20. She would go down to check on specific individuals and find them gone, replaced by people she didn't recognize, people she had no memory of admitting to her house. "I am losing myself," she wrote on February 10, 1860. "I feel as though I am dissolving, becoming part of the house itself. Sometimes I cannot remember if I have eaten. Sometimes I cannot remember what year it is. Sometimes I look in the mirror and do not recognize the face looking back at me. I am 41 years old, but I look 60. My hair is gray. My skin is papery and thin. I am disappearing." The neighbors had largely stopped talking to Hannah by this point. She had become the strange widow who lived alone, who kept her curtains drawn, who was sometimes seen wandering her backyard in the middle of the night. Children dared each other to knock on her door and run away. Shopkeepers watched her wearily when she came to buy supplies, as if they expected her to do something unpredictable. But no one suspected the truth. No one guessed that her house harbored dozens of fugitive slaves, that beneath her quiet, unremarkable home was a labyrinth of hidden rooms and secret passages that had somehow grown far beyond what any human architect could have designed. In April of 1860, the war that Hannah had been predicting finally seemed imminent. The Democratic Party split over the question of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican candidate, running on a platform of preventing slavery's expansion. The country was fracturing and everyone knew that violence was coming. Hannah began to prepare. She stockpiled food, dried beans, flour, salted meat, preserves, anything that would last. She filled every available container with water. She bought extra candles, extra blankets, extra medical supplies. She was preparing for a siege, though she couldn't have said exactly what form that siege would take. And the people kept coming, more than ever before. Word had spread throughout the network of abolitionists and Underground Railroad conductors that Hannah Brennan's house was the safest stop between Philadelphia and the Canadian border. People came who were injured, who were sick, who were pregnant, who were traveling with small children or elderly relatives. People came who had nowhere else to go. Hannah took them all in. She found space for them somewhere in the house, in the hidden rooms, in the tunnels, in the deep chambers that Douglas had built, and the house obligingly seemed to create more space as needed. The cellar kept expanding. Tunnels kept branching off into new directions. Rooms kept appearing where no room should have been. In June of 1860, Hannah experienced something that she would later refer to in her diary as the revelation. She was down in the deepest part of the cellar in the brick-lined chambers, bringing food to a group of people who had been staying there for several weeks. As she walked through the narrow passage, her candle flickering in the close air, she suddenly felt a presence, a consciousness that was not her own. The house was aware. It was aware of her, aware of the people hiding within it, aware of its own structure and its own purpose, and it was trying to communicate with her. Hannah dropped the basket of food she was carrying and pressed her hands against the brick wall. She could feel it, a pulse like a heartbeat thrumming through the stone, and she could hear it. Not words exactly, but something like words. A message that bypassed language and went straight into her mind. Protect. Hide. Keep safe. Never let go. Hannah understood then what was happening. The house had become something more than just a building. It had absorbed the fear, the desperation, the hope of everyone who had passed through it. It had taken on a purpose of its own, to protect these people at any cost. And it had found a way to do that by creating spaces that existed outside of normal reality. Spaces where the fugitives could hide not just from their pursuers, but from the world itself. Hannah staggered back to the main part of the cellar, her mind reeling. She sat on the cold floor and tried to process what had just happened. She wasn't mad. She hadn't been imagining things. The house truly was alive, truly was protecting the people who came to it. But at what cost? Hannah thought about all the people who had vanished from the hidden rooms who had never been seen leaving. Were they safe, hidden in the house's protective embrace? Or were they trapped, unable to escape, preserved in some impossible space between life and death? Anna didn't know, and she was terrified to find out. As summer turned to fall in 1860, Hannah made a tally. She went through all of her records, all of her diary entries, and tried to count every person who had ever stayed in her house. She worked on this project for weeks, cross-referencing entries, eliminating duplicates, trying to create an accurate list. The final number was 297. But even as she wrote that number down, Hannah knew it wasn't quite right. There were people she had forgotten to record, people who had come and gone in the confused fog of her deteriorating memory. There were the voices she heard at night, the shadows she saw moving through the house, the presences she felt but could not see. In November, 3 more people arrived, a mother and her 2 teenage sons. Hannah brought them down to the deep chambers, settled them in, gave them food and blankets, and as she did, she realized that with their arrival, the number had reached exactly 300 souls. The number felt significant somehow, like a completion, like a door closing. Hannah climbed back up to the main floor of the house and sat at her kitchen table. She opened her diary to a fresh page and wrote the words that would, 100 read years later, send chills down the spine of the construction foreman who read them. May God forgive me for what I have done. 300 souls passed through this house, and not one of them left the way they came in. She sat for a long time after writing those words, staring at them, wondering what they meant. Had she just acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding? That none of the people who came to her house truly left? That they all remained somehow trapped in the spaces between walls, preserved in rooms that existed outside of time? Or was she simply acknowledging that everyone who passed through her door was changed irrevocably? That they could never go back to being the people they had been before? That they had all died in some fundamental way and been reborn as something new? Hannah didn't know. She was too tired to think clearly anymore. She had given everything she had, her money, her health, her sanity, her soul, to the work of protecting these 300 people, and now that work was done. Over the next few weeks, Hannah made preparations. She stopped admitting new people to the house, turning them away with directions to other safe houses along the route. She stopped going down to the deep chambers to check on the people staying there. She started sealing things. She bricked up some of the hidden doors. She filled in sections of the tunnel. She moved heavy furniture in front of passages that led to the deepest parts of the cellar. And finally, she took her diary, wrapped it in oilcloth, placed it in a tin box, and sealed it behind a false wall in the cellar, in a cavity she constructed specifically for that purpose. "Let them find it someday," she wrote in a final loose page she left on her kitchen table. "Let them know what happened here. Let them judge me if they must. But let them know that I did what I thought was right, even if I was wrong, even if I damned 300 souls instead of saving them. At least let them know I tried." Hannah Grace Brennan died on February 11, 1862, at the age of 43. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the doctor who examined her body noted that she was severely malnourished and showed signs of extreme exhaustion. She weighed less than 90 pounds at the time of her death. Her hair was completely white. Her hands were gnarled and scarred. She looked like a woman in her 70s, not her 40s. The neighbors who found her, she had failed to answer her door for several days, and they had grown concerned, reported that the house was in disarray. Food was rotting in the kitchen. Candles had burned down to nothing. The windows were so dirty they barely let in light, but there was no sign of anyone else. No fugitive slaves hiding in the cellar. No evidence of illegal activity. Just an empty house and a dead woman who had apparently lived and died alone. Hannah was buried next to Thomas in the Catholic cemetery. Her grave was marked with a simple stone bearing her name and dates. No epitaph, no mention of her work. She disappeared into history as completely as the 300 people who had passed through her house. The house itself passed through many hands over the next century. The first new owner moved out after 6 months, complaining of strange noises. The second lasted a year. The third owner, a young couple with a baby, fled in the middle of the night after the wife claimed she saw figures moving in the walls. People, she said, trapped behind the plaster, reaching out to her. Subsequent owners reported similar experiences. Cold spots, whispers, footsteps, the sound of children crying, doors that opened and closed by themselves, objects that moved when no one was touching them. Most dismissed these phenomena as ordinary quirks of an old house. But some knew better. Some sensed that there was something fundamentally wrong with the place, something dark and hungry lurking beneath its ordinary exterior. By 1957, the house had gained such a reputation that no one would rent or buy it. It sat vacant for 3 years, slowly deteriorating until the city finally decided to demolish it and use the land for commercial development. And that's when the construction crew found the diary. The discovery sparked immediate interest among historians. Here was documented evidence of underground railroad activity in Lancaster, of a woman who had risked everything to help fugitive slaves. Researchers descended on the site, eager to excavate the hidden rooms Hannah had described in her diary to understand the scope of what she had built. What they found exceeded anything they had imagined. The cellar contained not 3 or 4 hidden rooms, as Hannah had originally built, but more than 20. The passages didn't follow any logical pattern. They branched and twisted, doubled back on themselves, descended to depths that should have been impossible given the water table in that area. Some tunnels were lined with brick and timber, clearly the work of skilled builders. Others seemed to have been clawed out of the earth by hand, the walls rough and uneven. The excavation took months. Workers mapped the passages as best they could. But the network was so complex that they never managed to create a complete diagram. Some tunnels ended in cave-ins. Others simply stopped, blocked by walls that appeared to have been sealed from the inside. And a few, the ones that disturbed the workers most, seemed to continue beyond the reach of their lights, descending into darkness so complete that even the brightest lamps couldn't penetrate it. They found evidence of habitation in the hidden rooms. Scratches on the walls where people had marked the passage of days. Drawings, some by children, some by adults depicting faces, landscapes, symbols whose meaning was unclear. Scraps of fabric, broken pottery, the remains of candles. And in one room, far deeper than any of the others, they found something that stopped the excavation cold. A set of shackles mounted on the wall with the remains of rope still attached to them. No one could explain the shackles. Had Hannah used them to restrain someone? Had they been there before she bought the house? Or had they been brought in by one of the fugitives, a grim souvenir of the bondage they had escaped? The excavation team also reported strange experiences. Equipment malfunctioned for no reason. Workers claimed to hear voices when no one was speaking. One man swore he saw a child running through the tunnels, and when he chased after her, she vanished into a wall. Another worker refused to go back into the deep chambers after he felt hands grab his shoulders in the darkness, though he was alone at the time. Eventually, the excavation was abandoned. The city decided that the site was too unstable, too dangerous, too expensive to fully explore. They filled in the passages they had opened, demolished what remained of the house, and built a parking lot over the site. Later, that parking lot was replaced with a small park. A plaque was erected commemorating Hannah Grace Brennan as a hero of the Underground Railroad. But historians continued to puzzle over the mystery. What had really happened in that house? How many people had truly passed through it? And most troubling of all, what had happened to them after they left? Researchers tried to trace the fates of the people mentioned in Hannah's diary. They searched census records, immigration documents, church registries, any source that might contain names or information. They found a few matches. People who had made it to Canada, established new lives, left behind records that proved they had survived their journey. But most of the 300 people Hannah wrote about could not be traced. Their names didn't appear in any records. There was no evidence they had ever reached Canada or anywhere else. It was as if they had simply vanished, swallowed up by the earth somewhere between Lancaster, Pennsylvania and the Canadian border. Some historians believe the explanation is simple. Records were poorly kept in that era, especially for people who were trying to remain invisible. Many fugitive slaves changed their names multiple times, making it impossible to track them. Many died along the way and were buried in unmarked graves. The lack of records doesn't necessarily mean something sinister happened, but others aren't so sure. They point to the strange expansion of the house, to the passages that seemed to grow on their own, to the testimonies of people who lived there and felt that something was deeply wrong. They point to Hannah's final diary entries, which suggest she knew or suspected that the people in her house weren't leaving. Not really. And they ask, what if Hannah wasn't helping people escape? What if, intentionally or not, she was trapping them? What if the house, in its strange, sentient way, decided that the best way to protect these people was to never let them leave? What if all 300 souls are still there, somehow, hidden in spaces that exist outside of normal reality, waiting in the dark for a freedom that will never come? There's no way to know for certain. The house is gone. The passages have been filled in. Hannah took her secrets to the grave, and the 300 people who trusted her, wherever they are now, cannot speak for themselves. But sometimes people who walk through the park that now occupies that land report strange feelings. A sense of being watched, a coldness that descends even on warm days, the sound of whispers that might be wind or might be voices. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, people claim they see figures standing among the trees. Men, women, children, dark-skinned, exhausted-looking, dressed in clothing from another era. The figures never speak. They never approach. They simply stand there watching, as if waiting for someone to acknowledge them. As if they want to be seen, to be remembered, to be known. And then after a moment, they fade away, disappearing into the shadows as completely as they disappeared from history. 300 souls pass through Hannah Grace Brennan's house, and somewhere in some form they remain, or 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 in some form they remain.